Every single day, we're all out there navigating a world that's built on a set of unspoken rules. Rules about how we're supposed to act around each other. But what happens when someone breaks one of those rules and you get hurt? Well, that's where tort law comes in. It's basically the law of everyday wrongs, and it covers everything from a simple slip and fall at the store to something much more serious. So let's dive in.
So let's start with the big question that really gets to the heart of tort law. Somebody wrongs you, but they didn't commit a crime. The police aren't getting involved. So what can you do? Maybe someone's carelessness caused an accident, or maybe their actions directly caused you harm. Well, tort law is the system that provides an answer, a way for you to seek a remedy for that wrong.
So, what exactly is a tort? At its core, it's a civil wrong. Now, this is really important. It's not criminal law, which is all about punishing people, and it's not contract law, which is about broken promises. The entire goal of tort law is something different. It's about compensation. It's about trying to restore the injured person to the position they were in before the wrong happened. The whole idea is to make them whole again.
Okay, so torts basically fall into three big buckets. First up are what we call intentional torts. And yeah, these are wrongs that happen when someone acts on purpose. But what on purpose means in the eyes of the law, well, it might actually surprise you.
Think about this classic and pretty awful prank. The person pulling the chair didn't want to break your arm, but they absolutely intended to pull the chair. And that's the key. In tort law, intent doesn't just mean you wanted the specific injury to happen. It also means you knew with substantial certainty that your action would cause a certain type of result. That certainty is enough.
So here are a few of the big ones. First, there's battery, which is the actual harmful or offensive contact. Now, people mix this up with assault all the time, but legally, assault is the act of putting someone in fear of that immediate contact. You can actually have an assault without a battery and vice versa. Then you've got false imprisonment, which is basically unlawfully restricting someone's freedom to move. And trespass to land is pretty much what it sounds like, going onto someone else's property without permission.
All right, moving on to our second category, and this one is a biggie. In fact, it's the single biggest area of tort law, negligence. This is the stuff that covers all those oops moments where nobody meant to cause harm, but someone's carelessness led to a serious injury anyway. This is your classic slip and fall scenario, and it shows the key difference from what we just talked about. Negligence isn't about an intent to hurt someone. It's about a failure to use the proper amount of care that society expects. And when that failure leads directly to an injury, well, you might have a case for negligence. But to win, the injured person has to prove four very specific things. Every single negligence case is built on these four elements. Think of them as four hurdles the injured person has to clear to win. First, they have to prove the defendant owed them a duty of care. Second, that the defendant breached that duty. Third, that the breach is what caused the injury. And finally, that the plaintiff suffered actual damages, like medical bills or lost income. You have to prove all four. Miss one, and the whole case falls apart. So how do we measure that duty of care? This is where the law gets a little abstract. It uses an objective standard called the reasonably prudent person. Now, this isn't a real person. It's a hypothetical ideal we use as a measuring stick. We don't ask, what was the defendant thinking? Instead, we ask, what would an ordinary, average person have done in that exact same situation? It's a pretty clever way to keep things objective. And that duty of care? It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It can actually change quite a bit depending on the situation, especially when you're on someone else's property. The level of care a landowner owes you depends entirely on why you're there. A trespasser gets the lowest level of protection. A social guest, the law calls them a licensee, is owed a higher duty. You have to warn them about dangers you know about. But a customer in a store, an invitee, is owed the highest duty of all. The owner has to actually inspect the property for dangers and make it safe. This is one of the most famous and kind of wild rules in all of tort law. It's called the eggshell skull plaintiff rule. So what does it mean? It means if your carelessness hurts someone, you are responsible for all the damage that results, even if the victim was unusually fragile and the extent of their injury was totally unforeseeable. So if you cause a minor fender bender, but the other driver has a rare bone condition and racks up $1 million in medical bills, you're on the hook for that $1 million. You take your victim as you find them. All right, on to our third and final category. And honestly, this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little counterintuitive. This is called strict liability, and it's a world where you can be held responsible for harm even if you did everything right and weren't careless at all. In these cases, fault
just doesn't matter. This example gets right to the heart of it. Let's say your neighbor is a professional, they follow every safety protocol to the letter, but a rock still flies out and shatters your window. Under strict liability, they are automatically responsible. The idea here is that if you choose to engage in an abnormally dangerous activity, you alone have to bear the risk of anything that goes wrong, no matter how careful you were. So, where does this wild no-fault rule apply? Well, it's pretty specific. It mainly covers 3 big areas. First, keeping wild animals. If your pet tiger gets out, you're strictly liable for the harm it causes. Second, as we just saw, are those abnormally dangerous activities, like using explosives. And third is a huge one in modern law, defective products. If a company sells a product that's defective and it hurts someone, they can be held strictly liable. Okay, so we've covered the 3 main ways a defendant can be found liable. But it's not always that simple. What happens if the injured person was also, well, a little bit at fault for what happened? The law has actually come a long way in how it handles this very question.
There's been a massive shift here. The old rule called contributory negligence was incredibly harsh. It was an all-or-nothing game. If you were found to be even 1% at fault for your own injury, you were covered 0. Nothing. Thankfully, today, almost every state uses what's called comparative negligence. This is a much fairer system, where a jury figures out the percentage of fault for everyone involved, and the injured party's award is just reduced by their share of the blame. So when we talk about damages, how does a court land on a big number like this? Remember, the goal is to make the plaintiff whole again. So that includes the obvious stuff, medical bills, lost wages from being out of work, but it also includes compensation for things that are harder to put a price on, like pain and suffering. It's the court's job to put a dollar value on absolutely everything the plaintiff lost because of what happened. So when you zoom out, you can see how all these pieces fit together. Tort law covers this huge range of human behavior, right? From a deliberate malicious act, to an honest but costly mistake, to a business activity that's just inherently dangerous. But the central idea running through it all is the same. It's a system designed to hold people accountable for the harm they cause others. And that really brings us to the final takeaway. Because tort law isn't just some abstract thing for lawyers to argue about. It's a direct reflection of the duties we all owe to each other every single day. So as you go about your life, driving your car, running your business, just walking down the street, it's worth asking yourself this question. Because it's really the foundation of how we all manage to live together in a safe and civil society. Thanks for joining me.